Hello, and welcome to this podcast series, Saints, Olympians of Our Faith, illustrating the beauty of the Universal Church. I'm your host, Krista Corbello. In today's episode, Daniel Park is with us to discuss the heroes of Team South Korea. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you for having me, Krista.
Thanks for being on the pod. It's so good to have you, Daniel, because I know you through the Newman Center. We've had many conversations about culture, and we've definitely had a conversation about World Youth Day being in Seoul in 2027. Just a little tidbit about that. When I went to World Youth Day in Portugal this past year, I had a little experience with another World Youth Day pilgrim from South Korea, gave me this pin that had the national flower as well as the flag in the middle of the flower. And when they gave it to me, it was just such a special pin. And he said, you know, this is for someone special, so I'm going to give it to you. And I said, you know, when World Youth Day is in South Korea, I'll go. I just had made that kind of resolution. And then they announced it at the end of the World Youth Day. So I was like, Daniel, we got to go. Let's go. You got to take us to the World Youth Day in Seoul.
God willing, yes, in 2027.
In 2027. So we're here to talk about, like I said, the heroes of Team South Korea. When our pre-interview, you gave a lot of cool history that I had never known about the church there. And I remember when, after your confirmation, when you went, you sent all these pictures of the cathedrals there and a lot of interesting stories. So I'm excited to hear what you have to share. So why don't you start off with highlights that you want to give of the faith in South Korea?
Sure. And just to give a little bit of background on myself before speaking more about the church in Korea. So I was born in South Korea, and my family immigrated to the U.S. In 2003 when I was 6 years old. And in fact, I grew up Presbyterian, and my father is a Presbyterian pastor at a Korean congregation back in Maryland. And he was invited to pastor at that congregation, and so he has been for the past 2 decades. I was not Catholic actually until fairly recently. I did become Episcopalian when I was in college for a couple of years, but it was really last May when I was confirmed here at St. Philip's, and I've been Catholic and blessed to be Catholic ever since. So to give a little overview of the Catholic Church in Korea, so Catholicism has been present in Korea ever since sometime in the 17th century onward. But it didn't really take off, I would say, until the 20th century. And even then, up until the 60s through the 80s, that's when it really began to take off in South Korea. And I believe as of the latest census, about 8% of Koreans identify as Catholics. Compare that to about half of the population that are not religious, and about 20-ish% who are Protestant, and about 25% who are Buddhists. So that's kind of the composition of religion in Korea right now. And we have a number of saints, actually. We are a country that has been built up on the blood of martyrs, and it definitely took a lot of lives for the seed of the gospel to be sown in that land. So we are proud of the fact that we are built on the blood of martyrs. We have certain unique challenges and missions that you probably won't find anywhere else in the world, actually. And I think that we have a very unique standing in the Universal Catholic Church as a whole.
You said a lot of interesting things about whenever it was first introduced. You said, even as far back as the 1600s, you said even some of the translation, the word for God in Korean, the word for Catholicism in Korean. Can you talk about the language heritage there?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting case, actually, because when Catholicism was first introduced, even before to Korea, but firstly to China in the 1600s, mainly by Jesuit priests. It was first introduced to your academics and government officials, and ultimately to the emperor himself. And these Jesuit priests, what they realized was that they were missionaries in a culture that was highly advanced. I would argue probably the most advanced in the world at that time. And they were evangelizing to a very educated, literate people who are deeply Confucian in their beliefs. So these Jesuit missionaries, in their wisdom, decided to try to use elements of Confucianism as much as they can, as long as it doesn't collide with church doctrine, to try to appeal to the people that they were dealing with at the time. So one thing that Matteo Ricci, who was one of the key Jesuit missionaries in China at the time, one thing that he realized was that there has always been a concept of a higher being in the Confucian way of thinking, which literally translates to heaven. I believe it's word Tian in Chinese or Chen in Korean, but the Confucians always had a sense of a higher being, but it wasn't necessarily a personal, relational being like the God that we confess in the Catholic Church. So what Matteo Ricci did was he took the word Tian and then combined it with another word, Ju, which literally translates to master, to come up with this new word, Tianju, to mean God. And so that literally translates to master of the heavens or heavenly master. And that's the word for God that was introduced to Korea as well around that time. In Korean, it is pronounced Cheonju, and Catholicism in Korea soon became known as Cheonju-gyo, or religion of the heavenly master. More and more so these days, I think the church prefers to be called Catholic 교회, which means Catholic Church, but I think most people would still know us as Cheonju-gyo. Even up until now.
You mentioned the Jesuits coming in, and that's where the first kind of introduction of the faith into Korea. But you said too that there was some Dominican controversy, and you were talking about it in the lens of Asian ancestral rituals. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about the insights there to give a little bit of the cultural context as well as paint it in the lens of the Catholic faith too? Where that kind of took us afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So even though initially it was the Jesuits who were evangelizing to government officials in China and ultimately in Korea too, there was another group of missionaries, the Dominicans, who were in turn mostly working with the lay people, with the masses. And we were talking about peasants, farmers, people who are mostly illiterate and mostly uneducated for that matter. And what they began to notice is that in Confucianism, there is a very big emphasis on respect and honor toward your parents, first of all, but your ancestors too. Your foreparents, your forefathers, so as to say. And one key element of Confucian life is that on their birthdays or on certain holidays, you would do these rituals to honor and to, in some cases, invoke your ancestors. Now, the Jesuits were aware of this practice, but what they saw from their eyes, working mostly with educated government officials, is that they didn't really see anything necessarily wrong with the practice or anything that could be considered idolatry, strictly speaking. That wasn't the case, though, for what the Dominicans saw, because these Dominicans, working mostly with uneducated peasants, saw a much more superstitious, almost corrupt form of these ancestral rituals, where they were seeing these peasants almost invoke the names of these ancestors as gods or goddesses. And they were basically thinking that if you don't do these rituals, then your ancestors will curse you. And that in turn, if you do these rituals, then your ancestors will bless you with a fruitful harvest or whatnot. So that's what the Dominicans saw. And both of these groups of missionaries reported what they saw back to the Vatican. And ultimately, the Vatican sided with the Dominicans. The Vatican was really concerned about what was going on and put out a decree saying you cannot partake in these ancestral rituals as a Catholic. Now, that became incredibly controversial, not only in China, but ultimately in Korea, which I would argue in certain ways was even more Confucian than China at the time. This actually became the reason for the martyrdom of many, many Catholics at the time. I would even argue 9 times out of 10 it had to do in one way or another with the ban on ancestral rituals. Because for the government at the time, the Joseon dynasty, any kind of rejection of partaking in these ancestral rituals was basically just outright, I would say, rebellion against the state. So it began to associate Catholicism with rebellion against the state or even anarchy. And it's around that time when the persecution began and lasted up until the late 19th century.
You know, you're referring to Tertullian, who said the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And you said that this was happening for centuries, right? And what is the response of the people after centuries of those martyrdoms? We have these famous Korean martyrs, and that's probably what a lot of people know about the church in Korea. But can you tell us a little bit more about the history and what happens after the rise of those martyrdoms?
Absolutely. And in fact, I do want to take a minute to talk about probably the most famous of the Korean martyrs, Andrew Kim Taegon, which some of you may have already heard of. And he's actually the first Korean priest, and he was martyred at the age of only 25. Now, he was a man that was born in 1821 to a well-to-do middle-class family. Now, it was around that time that the missionaries, particularly the missionaries from France, were very active in Korea at the time. And it was, in fact, I believe they're called the Paris Foreign Missions Society. They sent missionaries to a lot of places, but especially to Korea around this time. And fun aside, I believe it is said that Saint Therese of Lisieux was friends with a couple of priests and missionaries that were part of the Paris Foreign Mission Society. And for some time, she was discerning whether she should be a missionary. So there could have been a chance in some parallel universe that she might have been a missionary to Korea. So Andrew, or Kim Taegon by his Korean name, was baptized by one of these French missionaries. And he was actually selected by one of them to be admitted into seminary that at the time was in China. Time that missionaries from France, specifically from the Paris Foreign Missions Society, were actively working and evangelizing in Korea. And Andrew was chosen as one of the few students to be admitted into seminary that at the time was in China. So he studied there for a couple of years, and briefly he also ended up in Macau and the Philippines actually for some time. He proved to be just a really bright, intelligent student. He picked up French and Latin while he was there, and ultimately he was ordained the first Korean priest in Shanghai at the age of, I believe, 23 or 24, and then he was sent back to Korea to be serving as a priest there. Now, around that time, the government in Korea was feeling very, very anxious about foreign influences trying to infiltrate the borders. So when Andrew made his way into Korea, and as he tried to keep in touch with the missionaries that were in other parts of Asia, the government kind of caught on that something was going on, and they weren't very happy about that. So ultimately, he was arrested, and he was tortured actually, because he was accused of being a spy for foreign governments. The government, realizing that Andrew was an incredibly bright person, he knew Latin, he knew French, decided to try to convince him to become a very high-ranking government official. And also said, we will reward you with this and that and all these riches if you simply renounce your religion and work for us. And every time Andrew refused profusely, and ultimately he was sentenced to death and was martyred by beheading in 1846. I want to take a moment to read to you his last word because I think it's worth recalling. He said, quote, "Listen well because my last hour has arrived. The reason that I have been in contact with foreigners was for my religion and for my God, and it is for him that now I choose to die. And so eternal life is about to begin for me, and if you too should wish to be happy in the afterlife, then believe in the Lord." And that was his death. His body was kept in the ground for a number of weeks, actually, until 40 days after his martyrdom. A 17-year-old Catholic boy by the name of Vincent Lee Min-sik retrieved his body, carried it on his back for 5 straight days, and brought him to his current resting place. So that was the life and martyrdom of the most famous Korean martyrs. And there were many, many other martyrs around this time who shed blood for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of the church. And it was ultimately in 1886, I believe, that Catholicism was finally legalized in Korea.
Oh, wow. It was illegal before that.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I don't know if I missed that earlier, but that is interesting. In the lens of this little series, all the people who are representing all these different countries and cultures are talking about what I'm just going to call the magnanimity of the soul, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when we watch the Olympics, we see there's like a physical reality of these people who are jumping 12 feet in the air, and they're doing all these great flips in multiple different ways, and they're running super duper fast, and it's the height of what the human body is capable of. But when we learn about the lives of the saint, it's what the human soul is capable of through the grace of God. And what you're talking about is exactly that, is this great magnanimity, the ability to face all these odds, to be offered freedom, to be offered riches, and to declare that that is not enough. The last words, like you said, for him I choose to die so that I go to my eternal life. And, the kind of reoccurring theme is this idea of the eternal. And these saints really lived out what St. Paul talks about. I mean, there's a lot of Olympic kind of quotes in St. Paul's writings. I will run the race. I will persevere. These people are doing that. These saints are doing that. And so learning about them is so fascinating and so heroic. Like these are truly heroes. And you said there were quite a few. Like, I mean, I don't know the number.
I would say that there were probably at least tens of thousands of martyrs in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Wow.
At least.
So, but you did tell me, though, there was eventually kind of a shift in that in the 19th century. The church became a haven. So can you tell the story of how things began to change there? Absolutely.
Going into the 20th century, Korea became a Japanese colony from 1910 through 1945. And shortly after Korea was liberated at the end of World War II, a dictatorship took over. And that's how it was until 1987. And these military dictators didn't really care that much about religion, so there wasn't necessarily active persecution toward the church. We're probably neutral to semi-positive, but where the Catholic Church really stepped in for the sake of justice was in the 70s and the 80s, as more and more people began to protest these military dictatorships, and there were demonstrations really all over the country around this time. And particularly during this time, the church in Korea became a kind of haven for these protesters. And there's a very famous account of sometime in the 70s, I believe, when protesters were demonstrating in Seoul and they were being pursued by the riot police, and they saw the central cathedral, Myeongdong Cathedral, and so they knocked on that door and were asking for sanctuary, and they were kept inside that church until the police were gone. Now, when the police came up to the cathedral to ask that these protesters be turned over, Cardinal Kim Soo-hwan Stephen, he told the police, if you want the protesters, you'll have to go through me first, and then through the priests, and then through the nuns, and then you'll find the protesters. And I think it was through a series of these kinds of events that the public began to see Catholicism as really a bastion for justice and for peace. And it was following this era that the church really began to grow rapidly in Korea, up until the 2010s, when about 10% of South Koreans were Catholic. And that culminated with Pope Francis's visit to Korea in 2014. Now, those numbers have decreased a little bit after COVID, but nevertheless, I would say that the public perception of Catholicism is overall very positive compared to Protestantism.
Now, I have a question for you, Daniel, because you were raised in a more Protestant denomination. Did you know about this history of the Catholic Church? Did you know about it before your confirmation, or did you learn about it afterwards, and then you were surprised by deep roots of the Catholic faith in your country?
I think I knew it abstractly here and there. I knew the general history. I knew about some of the saints, like Saint Andrew Kim Taegon, but it didn't really occur to me just how much blood had to be shed for the seeds of the gospel to be planted in that country, and just how often that is the case all throughout the world. So I didn't really have a full appreciation of that until I was confirmed Catholic last year.
Can you talk about whenever you visited there the first time after your confirmation? I felt like you were having a profound experience, but I actually never really asked you about it. So what was it like going there where your family is, where you were born, and looking at these places you might have already been before, but now you were looking at it through a Catholic lens? What was that experience like?
Sure. I mean, it certainly was a profound experience, and it was around Easter time, actually, that I was there in Korea, so it just added to that profoundness. I will say that as a Catholic going back to Korea, you begin to see the spiritual needs of the people, and you begin to ache for that people because you know that the church is such a rich deposit of all the graces that they currently need, and yet they don't know about it. They don't know about it. I would probably argue that among developed countries, South Korea tends to be the most materialistic / consumeristic. It's probably not a coincidence that it has the lowest birth rate right now among all developed countries. Every time I go back, I see that tangibly, and it just makes me ache for these lost souls who are in need of the gospel, who are in need of the saving message of Christ. And it just really makes me believe that the Catholic Church in Korea has a crucial mission more than any time else in history right now. And I only pray that the Church will be able to live up to that full potential in the 21st century.
Well, and I feel like seeds are already being tilled right now as World Youth Day is preparing to go there. I mean, that's going to be like millions of pilgrims. Mm-hmm. And the witness of the pilgrims, it really is a phenomenal sight to see. I've been a few World Youth Days now, and it really is a display of the universal church. And, you know, we hear that phrase a lot, the universal church, and the mission of this little series is kind of to paint the picture of like how many different colors, how many different flavors the church is and how alive the church is in all these different parts of the world. And I think whenever people kind of expose themselves to that, whether or not they get to go to a World Youth Day, like I'm trying to bring the World Youth Day spirit in this podcast, because the universal church is a beautiful sight to see. And it makes you realize how big God is. It makes you realize how big the church is and how big the faithful are and what universal really means. I mean, Catholic means universal, but when you get to see it through the stories of the lives of the saints, I think it kind of paints a clearer picture. I guess if we're thinking about the particular flavor or the particular color of the church in South Korea, you mentioned what you think it needs, but what do you think it already has? What do you think is the hope for the church there, that if you're not born or raised or exposed to that culture already and you wouldn't already know, what is something that you think they can teach us, the culture can teach us, you can teach us because of your unique experiences?
Absolutely. I think that more than anything else, what stands out about the church in Korea is the respect that it has for the religions and cultures that were already there for thousands of years. And this might be perhaps partially because Korea is still labeled as missionary territory, officially speaking. So there is, I think, a greater pastoral need to be much more sensitive about, let's say, the Buddhist traditions or the Confucian traditions that a lot of people still hold to. So there's a lot of respect toward these religions than perhaps some other forms of Christianity currently in Korea. I would also go so far as to say that the Korean perception of God tends to be a little softer than maybe what we're used to here in the West. I think that perhaps in the West there is maybe sometimes a heavier emphasis on God as a judge, a God who has these list of rules and, wants to enforce them. Not to say that this isn't the case with how a lot of Koreans view God, but I think there is a stronger sense of God being a very merciful and graceful being. And I would say that I think a lot of Korean Catholics view God almost as this, good old grandpa figure that is just a safe place, a safe haven for you to go to. Now, I think there needs to be a balance, obviously, because God is love, and he also yearns for us to be holy as well. So I think there is a balance. I think one particular problem that we've been seeing with Korean Catholics, some of them, is that they still would go to fortune tellers or shamans even, which really should not be happening for Catholics. So I think there still are certain areas where better catechesis needs to happen and where certain things do need to be enforced a little more. But I do think that the way that a lot of Koreans view God in this very tender, merciful way, I think can actually be a benefit when it comes to evangelizing the public. I think the public is so tired of such a merit-based competitive society that they are yearning for that unconditional love that whether you fail or fall or mess up is always there for you. I think the public really needs that, and I really feel that the Korean Catholic Church has a mission to play in spreading that message.
Absolutely, and it really emphasizes the relational aspect of who God is, right? Because if you're saying that he's got a familial kind of figure culturally or in the eyes of Korean Catholics, that is a big win, right? Because if you view God as a judge, you don't want to have a relationship with a judge. No. So yeah, the relational aspect. And I think even kind of echoing back what St. Andrew said, it's for him I choose to die. Like I'm not dying for a cause. I'm not dying for a religion. I'm dying for Jesus. Like this, it's for him. And if you want eternal happiness, maybe you could read it again. I don't know. If you want eternal happiness, I suggest you do the same. Like he's really calling us to have a relationship with God. So that is a very interesting thing. One other thing that you haven't mentioned that I want you to talk about, you were talking about culturally how science bloomed in Western Europe and the meticulousness of the numbers versus a master-apprentice role that maybe you would see in more like Eastern Asian countries. So can you talk about that relational aspect and the differences that you reflected on in our pre-interview?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such an interesting point, actually, because I think that throughout the development of the Western Church, centered in Rome, I think there was an inclination toward being very meticulous and structural about doctrine, especially with the scholastics in the medieval era. And I think that has been a great blessing intellectually for the Church. I think it is what sets the Church in the West apart from a lot of other traditions throughout the world. I will say that Korean culture is still somewhat meticulous when it comes to record keeping, but there's a much stronger emphasis on the relational aspect of things too that maybe can't always be articulated into words or books. So I gave you an example before of how to shoot cannons if you're a military general. In the West, you would find very meticulous documents of how the powder is to be prepared and how the cannon is to be angled and how this should happen and that. And it really is no coincidence, I would argue, that modern sciences bloomed out of the West, out of that tradition. Whereas in the East, and particularly in Korea, there would be a document that generally lays these things out, but really the details of those would be passed on relationally between a master and an apprentice, and so on and so forth. And I think this is just a cultural thing, and I think this really does bleed into our religious lives as well, in that maybe in the West there is a heavier emphasis on whether certain rules are being followed to the word, whether certain things are kept meticulously, even the fact that we go to confession and are supposed to number the number of times that we have sinned particular sins. I think that's very characteristic of the Western expression of Christianity, whereas in the East, and even amongst our Orthodox brothers and sisters, you would find that in confession, it typically isn't a case that you would have to number the times that you have sinned. In fact, they don't have the distinction between mortal versus venial sins. They don't have that categorization in the Orthodox Church. So I think those are cultural differences that came to be over time. I think there are things that we can certainly learn from each other. Yeah.
I really like the master-apprentice kind of relationship that you were mentioning, because it kind of highlights to me from like a sociological level maybe that Asian cultures, Filipinos too, very interdependent, right? People know that they belong to each other. One way that that's kind of expressed, I guess, in Filipino culture and Filipino language is that there's like hundreds of conjugations for the verb to eat, because it refers to like, who are you eating with? Hey, all of you come eat. There are many conjugations of this verb because it's such a relational culture, interrelational, that there's an interdependence there. And it seems like that Korea is kind of the same way, whereas in America it's very independent. You move out when you're 18, figure it out for your own. So I do love that approach, or that lens, master apprentice. It makes me think of my dad, who, although he's Cajun, he loves the martial arts, and he always has a teacher teaching, I don't know all the distinctions, but he has many, many black belts, and he always is talking about meeting a new kind of master in this kind of way. To him, it's like an art. Like I always felt like the way my dad looks at the martial arts is the way I always looked at music. It's like an expression for him, but also he really wants to learn it from an expert. He had a karate school, actually, that's how my parents met. And so he talks about like what the relationship is between the person that he learned from and how it kind of, formed the way that he was teaching, and how he still learns even now. So I just really, really enjoy that kind of relational lens of the faith too, like not just of God, but like of the faith, that we learn from each other. And it's not like a textbook thing. Like we're not, although theology is very important. And I love a good quote from a doctor of the church, right? But sometimes it's more effective to be learning about someone's life and their experience and how they encountered God. And that's why I think this series is so fascinating, because each culture kind of approaches God in their own lens, in their own way. And for me, this is a way to learn about that. So thanks for teaching us a little bit about your heritage and what you learned about the church there. Is there anything else that you want to share specifically for how maybe your faith or your heart or your intellect has been formed by Korean culture or the saints or the history?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would consider it a great blessing that I grew up Korean and that I found this particular tradition, especially through the lens of Korean culture and all the uniqueness that comes with it. I think the more we begin to learn about other cultures, and especially how the faith is expressed in these different cultures, we begin to see many new lenses and angles from which people see God and interact with Him. And I think that there's always something that you can kind of get out of it for yourself, for your own spiritual journey. So I really want to be more open to different expressions of Catholicism. My girlfriend is half Mexican and half Honduran, so I've been having a lot of exposure to the Latin American expression of Catholicism in recent days, starting with Our Lady of Guadalupe and all these rich, beautiful traditions that have come to be over the past few centuries. And there's always something I can pick up from those expressions for my own relationship with Christ. So I invite you all to do the same. I invite you, all of you, if you are able, to join us in 3 years' time in Seoul, Korea. Korea is just a really, really beautiful country to explore and travel. You'll see palaces and temples, hundreds of years old, mountains, beaches, obviously cities too, and the countryside. It's such a beautiful place to be. So I welcome all of you to join us there if you're able, and also to keep the church there in your prayers, please, for the conversion of all people, and especially for people who are currently being oppressed in North Korea too. I ask that you would please remember them in your prayers.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for the invitation again to World Youth Day. I have so much hope that we're going to go together. We're going to bring a group, and I'm really excited to start learning Korean on Duolingo. So not sponsored, but maybe we should start learning now. Maybe you can give us lessons.
The Korean alphabet is so straightforward that you probably can pick it up in 2 or 3 hours.
Nice.
Yeah. The language, on the other hand, might need a little more time because just like Tagalog, you have hundreds of conjugations for different people, different situations. So give it a little more time. Now. Yeah.
we have more time for that. We gotta learn some Italian first. Yeah, Team Italy will be out in November. Anyway, thank you, Daniel. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your witness. Let's end with a little glory be prayer. Actually, do you know it in Korean?
Let us pray. 성부와 성자와 성령의 이름으로 아멘. 영광이 성부와 성자와 성령께 처음과 같이 이제와 항상 영원히 아멘. 성부와 성자와 성령의 이름으로 아멘.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you, Krista, for having me.